Hope everybody's doing well today. This is Evan with Progressive Farms, and today I'm going to try to make you think a little bit differently. Maybe not, we'll see. But I like to last week was a little bit of an introduction. This is going to be setting the table for dinner and start getting into the guts of what bioenergetic agriculture is, starting next week and going forward. But it's important that the thread of what I do is, there's more to life than what's physically here, and inviting that level of imagination towards our agriculture. And it is my humble opinion that life force in agriculture and the locality of our food and the purity of our food and the nutrient density of our food is really the answer to every issue that faces society. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a crash course from my perspective of kind of pre-agriculture to beyond organic, and look forward to seeing what you guys think. So in the beginning, there was soup, the primordial soup, as it's called. So, we'll argue about how many billions of years ago it was, but a long, long time ago, the earth was dominated by what's called photoautotrophs, which are essentially what's called photosynthetic organisms found in the ocean today and found in sulfur pools and a lot of extreme environments. And they started creating the atmosphere, inhaling carbon dioxide, exhaling oxygen, which is the photosynthetic application, dying, eating themselves, and oxygenating the environment, built up organic matter as they began to creep into land. And this was the mix where essentially what you got is the first soil, which is a really fascinating thought form there. Where did soil come from, right? It's kind of like, where did a plant come from? Where did a cell come from? Where did a bacteria come from? Interesting questions. Further back we looked, it's fair to say the less we know. But you get this first soil environment, and you've seen one of these things in that picture on the bottom there. It's called a lichen, walking in the forest on dead trees or living trees for that matter, and rocks. And this is like I said, what's called a lichen. And a lichen is really the perfect representation of nature, in that it's a symbiotic relationship, a give and a take, as opposed to parasitic, where you have an algae marrying a fungi, and the fungi is performing the solubilization of the ions that the mutual organism needs to grow, and the algae is photosynthesizing, producing the food for the organism, and they have this really happy marriage. It's an ancient organism. But you get basically these lichens creating soil out of rocks at a higher level. And you think about that process of, humus being created, plants coming about, and we're going to talk about some of that next week in terms of the history of plants. But, you think about, you give humus enough heat that turns into coal, and we're basically living off of that in a non-sustainable way in modern times. We're living off of ancient soil, the ancient work of microorganisms. So it's really amazing for me to think about this. And so you move through this process of soil coming into life and relevance, and you get to agriculture. You can see from the images on the bottom, we went from, a subsistence, hunter-gatherer to, let's say, one person standing in a field or observing some volunteers growing out a waste pile or whatever it may be, that they discovered agriculture. Well, what's really interesting is agriculture happened in about 11 different places at different times and relatively the same epoch. And, make the connection that back then, farmers didn't talk to each other. They couldn't pick the phone up and call halfway around the world and get ideas. This was an impulse, if you will, where, farming became real, and that in a real sense is the start of humanity, when we established societies in one place year round, and maybe at this beginning it was a couple of different places, but the point is we weren't going down the road to find our next meal. We were growing it where we were, And it wasn't until that point where people could start to specialize and, you know, assume some level of interest and responsibility outside of just sustaining life with what we could find to eat and drink. So you've got this scenario where, you know, 10, 15,000 years, you know, the beginning of agriculture to the point of industrial agriculture, which has really only been about the last 100 years. And man, we've made a lot of progress and we've done a lot of damage in the last 100 years. And in some respects, I think it's a good thing. I mean, we had to screw it up to figure out how to do it right, because where we're coming from before industrialization, it was all by default. You know, there were no chemicals, there were no biocides, there was no ability to go out and fertilize plants with the types of artificial fertilizers that are available on the conventional agricultural market. And, so I think we're reaching the point where we understand collectively that our agriculture doesn't support the type of living that people should expect from the food that we eat. And this was you know, and so I think the next stage is kind of getting back to the roots, if you will, not moving back into you know, the woods, which is the way a lot of people frame it, but literally applying these living concepts to the agriculture that we're undertaking. Got a long way to go. You know, estimates of less than 1% of U.S. farmland is certified organic, which is fairly remarkable in concept. You see organic everywhere, and it just kind of gives you a moment of pause to think actually how much conventional agriculture is happening. And on every one of those farms, we're using biocides that are denaturing the soils and generating our agricultural environments. So it's up to us to regenerate that. So, you know, wanted to provide a couple of resources, and I'm prepared. I'm going to get better to provide the show notes to Josiah so you guys can follow some of these threads. But this book was seminal for me 10, 15 years ago, maybe longer than that now. My grandfather recommended it to me, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jerrod, and it gives a very amazing expose of how domestication became about. You know, in Africa, they didn't have any domesticable animals. They didn't have cows and pigs and chickens. They had zebras. And the continent's north-south instead of east-west, so the climate wasn't ideal. And he researches it from that perspective and shows why civilization progressed faster in certain areas than others. So I'd highly recommend it if you're interested in this kind of thought. But by definition, agriculture is a manipulation of the natural environment. You know, I made up the term evolution to account for for human evolution. You know, when you say humans evolve in a Darwinian context, it kind of dilutes the responsibility that we have with consciousness. It just kind of assumes that we're going through our motions and we're doing what we're doing, but you know, there's no survival of the fittest. Arguably, the most unfit humans reproduce the most. And it's interesting to think about. Without words, that limitation of language doesn't allow us to identify it. It's, you know, my opinion that by, you know, differentiating the method of you know, fitness and natural selection and these things that drive animal evolution don't apply to humans. And that, again, brings out a level of responsibility that we have to do it right. Conscious co-creation, if you will. So, you know, let's ask ourselves, are we really conscious about what we're doing? You know, this is what agriculture has become. We're spraying known carcinogenic, toxic compounds all over food that we've genetically modified to not die from it. So, you know, I stop short of really blaming. I think it's literally that we had to go down this road to understand what we needed to do to change it. But you know, this is Kansas. Each one of those has a pivot and it's irrigating. Most of this is probably animal feed. You know, just things like this feedlot image really represent what agriculture should be. We're so far away from our food, we don't really even know what it is anymore. Now, many of you out there are looking to get back to it and are already steeped in you know, decentralizing and strengthening your local food systems. But you know, feedlots don't do humanity justice. I work on a farmyard project, and you know, rather than lawns, look at this. This is the Gervais family out in California, a pretty famous example of a homestead, and you know, the stats of what they're producing is pretty amazing. You know, I think they live on less than $2 a day food costs. They're producing 99% of their produce. They're making 75 grand a year after what they eat. This is a third of an acre lot, somewhere in there. 75,000 savings, I should say. 20,000 in sales, over and above what they eat. I think it's a family of 4 or 5. So, you know, these things are possible with intention. They're just kind of a different speed from how we've been operating in the recent past. So, you know, think of it this way. We've got original farmers, you know, where you have this unconscious organic, you know, everything was sustainable because it could not be. It was balance and diversity built into what we did. You know, the farming and the agriculture was part of the living system. It didn't degenerate. It sustained. You know, we lived in the earth, not on it. And so this is an image of all of the places where agriculture occurred. There's 11 places. And you can see different aspects of the world in relatively the same time periods woke up to this stuff. And then, you know, humanity fast forward, this happens, and you get a population boom that's just really hard to quantify relative to where history had been taken. And you can kind of see the little dip there and the bubonic plague, and boom, you know, all of a sudden humans are everywhere. So what do? We gotta feed people. And this was, you know, the Green Revolution, GMOs, you know, it became artificial. You know, we started to degenerate the environment, separated ourselves from living systems. The mindset was living on the earth, not in it. And, you know, the result of this kind of thing is a lack of nutrient density in the food that we eat. 1950, there was enough iron as 26 apples. In one apple, there's 26 apples in 1998, according to USDA data. You know, project out across the food system. This is one thing that justifies the idea of juicing. You know, you can't sit down and eat 26 apples calorically. So, you know, if you juice it, you can start to get that level of nutrient density. And you can imagine if everybody had the power of juicing whole foods on a daily basis, how much healthier society would be. Again, I think it really answers the healthcare issue in America, job security, decentralization, you know, all the aspects of economic development, you know, it can be done through agriculture. So I want to show you a couple slides, you know, in that vein. You know, this is real. You've got a rural population that's tracking down and an urban population that's tracking up. We've got, you know, farm jobs, 90%, you know, in the 1800s of people were involved in farming in some capacity. Today it's, you know, less than 2%. The majority of those aren't full-time jobs. So, you know, the way we grow our food has changed drastically over the years. This one is crazy alarming to me. I mean, this is showing the size of farms in different countries. I mean, look at China. 95% of their farms are 2 hectares or smaller. A hectare is 2.5 acres, so say 5 acres or smaller. In the U.S., that number is 4%. That explains a lot in regards to the state of agriculture in the U.S. Not to say that China is much better, but it doesn't take much to imagine they have a much higher level of resiliency in their agricultural system than people in the U.S. I mean, if we didn't have access to what we could go into the supermarket and buy, I don't know how far we'd get. So you know, when I ran across this data, I was really amazed. And you know, the result is also disease. The problem of diagnosing this is there's no direct smoking gun. There's no, you know, this deficiency creates this affliction because that works variably in different people. And it also, you know, how do you account for the diversity of a diet in regards to how one person is healthier than not? There's no smoking gun. There's no way to reverse and deduce that into an understanding that's actionable outside of an individual capacity to understand it and do something about it. But you can see it's a little blurry, but you know, when the industrialization and mechanization agriculture occurred, all of the nutrient levels in food began to decline. And you know, we can't really get much lower than we're at. So, you know, again, this all speaks to, you know, this idea that empty food is creating empty people, and that manifests in illness. Here's some more data along those lines. I mean, look at the asthma. You know, to say asthma is caused by a magnesium deficiency is not necessarily fair to say. There's associations there, but how do you design a study that proves that in a direct way that would be publish in Nature publication or some kind of PubMed approach. It takes a level of intention around the research capacity that we have and a level of funding from people who don't necessarily want this story to be told, for us to come to this collective understanding so that it's on the news at night. I mean, if ever, for that matter. But it's safe to say, this is not agriculture. We shouldn't have to protect ourselves from the food that we eat. So, I don't want to come across as holier than thou here. It's just pointing out the obvious for anyone who's, taken some time to look into the way food is grown and the state of food today. So, I was fortunate enough, and I hadn't been in a number of years, but I've gone to the Acres Conference for a long time. And Charles Walters, who's since passed away in 2009, I was able to see him speak a couple of times at the conference. Coined a term called toxic rescue chemistry that I think is really apt, and I just wanted to kind of bring that into the vernacular. The idea that we treat our symptoms, right? We create weak plants that are attacked by parasites and pests, and then we go and try to kill the problem rather than nourishing the organism. It's a direct parallel to people. Are we going to take the pill to eat more fast food, or are we going to change our diet and take a probiotic? In a nutshell, that may be what we're going to talk about over time on this program, is just kind of coming to these simple understandings. And it's been my experience that when our perspective can change around these things, our actions change, and we begin to do things that allow us the type of result and the type of health and the type of feedback from nature that we want to tell us that we're heading in the right track. Then we can get her to do a lot of more work for us than having to pay to do it for ourselves and our time and our resources. It's another parallel, track of what we'll be talking about. This is not just the right thing to do. It works better. It costs a lot less, and it heals the earth. It's a true win-win-win. So bioenergetic agriculture is kind of a thought form around that. Fair to say that we need to be progressive farmers. You have, the pre-farmers, you have the modern farmers, and we're going to be progressive farmers, right? We have to be consciously regenerative, not by default, but through intention. We got to get back to the balance and the diversity that justified the quality of the plants and the food that we were growing before industrialization. That conscious co-creation is so important. So we need to be beyond organic. Organic is definitely a step in the right direction, but I can't imagine that the people that kind of conjured up the spirit of organic agriculture intended for there to be an organic frozen pizza in Walmart. It's just not something that, maybe it's cleaner, maybe it's not. You can grow inferior food organically. That if you're just putting compost on completely deficient and minerally imbalanced soil, it's not going to fix everything. It's going to help. It's not going to fix everything. So, you kind of got to take a couple more steps into that in terms of, the soil testing and proactively adding the microbes that justify organic growing. Organics is really about feeding microbes, but the microbes have to be there to be fed, right? They don't jump over the fence or parachute in, so to speak. So adding the yeast to make the beer, the bread is seminal to this these concepts working. So this is really where bioenergetics comes from. The physical, the plant itself, the soil structure, the mineral, the balancing of the soil minerals through base saturation, biological realm in terms of the diversity of microbes, using organic inputs and feeding the life in the soil rather than feeding the plant directly. And then the energetic capacity, this concept of life force, and, using biodynamic methods and different things like that. So this is kind of the framework of what we'll be talking about going forward in this program. So I wanted to introduce just some further resources to kind of stretch your mind towards the principles of what I'm talking about here. And in some respects, it's kind of treading in the energetic realm, which I think is frankly the most unique and hard to grasp, wrap your arms around. And I wanted to give you some ideas that, the stories we tell ourselves aren't necessarily true. They're convenient. Not unlike Newtonian physics in grade school. We sit there and talk about Newton all day, and Newtonian physics is kind of a dinosaur relative to quantum physics, and even that's being altered, and it's all an idea-driven thing. So our ability to come to terms with something as a law or truth is a very powerful concept. It's powerful in its influence. It's also powerful in mitigating our ability to think differently and be our own expert within that authority, so to speak. So, you know, I like to think of truth as being more of a dynamic living concept that can be proven in different ways. We all know there's truths that we hold that most people might not believe, and it doesn't really matter what other people think. And in some respects, that's what we're looking to do with these ideas. It's really kind of get to the idea of, you know, having them sink into some level that presents not an opportunity to provide some action around it, see it work. And frankly, if the agricultural consultant is telling you that that's woo-woo and witchcraft and you've seen it work, it just doesn't really matter what he thinks, right? So that's in a sense a lot of been my experience. I didn't believe most of this when I first exposed myself to it 15 years ago, but I've had a long time to validate it and to understand the merits of it to the extent where, you know, I don't call myself an expert. I think there's maybe too many experts in the world, but you know, I've had those experiences that make them real for me. And in that line of work, you know, you carry a burden of proof. It can be real heavy at times, you know. And this doesn't necessarily just apply to agriculture, but in that vein, you know, it really, like I said, comes down to having an experience, you know, applying some of these concepts on your landscape or your farm, and, you know, talking to others about them, and you know, really understanding them from our own perspective. And, you know, school is a very powerful method of educating people collectively, but it can do the same thing as that expert conversation I was having a minute ago, where you've got, you know, an authority telling you a certain way of doing things that might not make sense for that child. I had those experiences in high school and middle school, and looking back, and, you know, it was more of a social exercise for me than it was teaching me what I wanted to know. I didn't learn what I wanted to know from school. I learned how to think, and there's a value in that. But, you know, the rigidity in school, I have a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I see it directly. And, you know, you know, at home, we're fortunate enough to give them some perspective around that. But, you know, growing up, I thought school was true. You know, everything they told me was something that I needed to know and remember and apply. And, you know, I think we've all kind of had our own experiences in that regard. You know, we teach all kids the same way, and we fertilize all our soils the same way, and we're creating imbalances. You know, and I always like to tell the story of water fluoridation. Probably do a whole presentation on it, but if you hadn't looked into it, check it out, and maybe call your water system and do some digging and just see how backwards this program is. We spit our toothpaste out. What says that we should be swallowing it? There is no need for the fluorine ion in the human body, and it connects directly with our bones. It's high affinity for calcium. It's the only form it occurs in nature, and yet we're dosing everybody indiscriminately through a water system. What happens if you drink 5 glasses of water a day and I drink 10? You know, would a doctor prescribe twice the medicine to me and not to you? It's unprecedented that we're medicated outside of our consent. So, you know, you think about these kinds of things, and, you know, the historicity and you know, the investment made in inferior ways of operating in the societal level get ingrained, and it takes a lot of energy to move it. So, you know, collectively, we don't know what we can't measure. And that's something that we can decide is not true. You know, can we measure everything that's relevant towards a living system? I'm gonna argue that you can. So I wanted to give you some examples. You know, Rudolf Steiner was known, who you hear me talk about him a lot. He was is a real big influence on me. He passed away in 1924, but this link at the bottom talks through the concept that the heart is not a pump. I don't know if you knew it, but the blood is moving in a fetus before the heart is formed. You know, can a muscle the size of a fist move blood through vessels, 75,000 miles of blood vessels and capillaries? You know, I'm not sure. Every pound of fat has 7 miles of blood vessels. That's pretty amazing. You know, if it was mechanically that strong, it'd be moving at 100 pounds a mile high. It's a tall order. So, you know, everybody has the understanding that the heart moves the blood around. There's a very sincere line of thought that says that's not true. It's kind of interesting to think about that. there's a concept called biological transmutation. Louis Kervran did some experiments back in the 1920s that, I believe it's the 1920s, that he proved he could restrict calcium to a chicken's diet, yet it still was able to lay an egg consistently. Fascinating. The body was manifesting the calcium from some way, in a measurable way. It's a bit like cold fusion and some of those ideas where energy is created out of nothing, and our laws tell us that that's not possible. Yet we can come up with all these examples where it does. The great Carl Sagan was very skeptical of it as well. So it just goes to show you the power of ideas. And when these things are ingrained in how we think and how we do things, it's again very difficult train to get off of. This is the book. If you wanted to seek it out, I'll make sure I put all this stuff in the show notes if you don't want to take any kind of notes. This is from a book called The Body Electric. I don't know if you know this, I didn't until I read it, but up until the age of, 11 years old, you can cut the tip of your finger off above the knuckle and it'll regenerate, just like a lizard tail. Kind of wild, right? Not sure many doctors know that. They discovered it by accident over in the UK. So again, how many of these scenarios can we talk to ourselves about to tell us that, the way these things work isn't necessarily how we've defined them, particularly on a two-dimensional book. Very difficult to do. You think about agriculture and the conversation of, the qualitative versus the quantitative. We're a very quantitatively driven society in the modern world. The quality of what we produce has waned significantly. You can apply it almost across the board. So, organic, bioenergetic, these regenerative agriculture is quality driven to more of an extent than conventional. I like to coin the term personal agriculture. That really takes agriculture into your own hands from an eating and a growing perspective. It's qualitative. Industrial agriculture is about yield, shelf life. So, does that kind of model hit the sweet spot of what food should be? It's not proving to be the case. So begs the question, can quality be measured? It's difficult. We're trained we trained ourselves in the modern world to kind of rip apart the whole to find the singular path from A to B. This active ingredient does this. And whenever we extract an active ingredient from the whole, we mess with the magic. It's kind of like ascorbic acid. I don't know if you knew, but the FDA allows orange juice manufacturers and others as well, but specifically in the orange juice industry, there's a book called Squeezed. I'll include that in the show notes. That's kind of depressing. It just is an expose of the orange juice industry. And they basically irradiate all of the fresh orange juice so that they can store it. And then it's a sugar water, tasteless really, in terms of what orange juice is. And then they hire perfume companies to add back flavor packs. This is why all the different brands taste a little bit different and they're so consistent. And the FDA allows these companies to put ascorbic acid, which is an artificially derived vitamin C equivalent, into the vitamin C so that it's 100% of our daily value. But very small percentage of that actually comes from the fruit itself. So again, we've really pulled the wool over our eyes. But, there are ways to do this. Will they be accepted mainstream and collectively? Maybe not. But, take this example. Steiner's associate, Dr. Ehrhard Pfeiffer, developed this under Steiner's direction back in the 40s. So taking chromatograms just about anything, but it measures the life force in a sample. So the one on the left here was grown conventionally. The one on the middle got the biodynamic preps applied to the compost and the field sprays used, and the one on the right was at the end of the season. So you can see that the expression of energy is highest in the one on the right. And if you asked 100 people, I'd argue majority, if not all of them, would choose. If they were asked which one would you want for your soil, would pick the one that was more expressive on the right. So can you replicate that and create one that's more expressive? Yes. Is it going to be the same chromatogram when that happens? No. And therefore, that is not a valid way of applying the scientific method and generating truth. So, there are ways to do this. It's just a matter of whether we accept them or, in the face of the collective conventional wisdom. ideas are very real things. Our consciousness is actionable. It starts with an idea, conceptual and perceptual and subjective and objective, and there's a balance in there. Same with good and evil. I'm of the school that there is not pure good. Everybody's got a little good and evil. It's our ability to work off of that and account for it and choose to be different in terms of the evil posture of that dynamic that really allows us the expression of what humanity is. I don't think it's fair to say there's I think it's not a duality. There's a human centeredness in this kind of thing. And this graphic says a lot. It's we need more wonder in our science. In a sense, art is that, and the combination is really the bridge. And that's really what anthroposophy is. Steiner's platform of phenomenology, epistemology in regards to how he saw the world and approached it. It's Bucky Fuller, real wealth is ideas plus energy. Very true. He was a very wise man. So I wanted to show you a quick clip of this piece of an interview, and it looks like it's not going to come up, so I'm just going to take this tag. This is Craig Holdridge. He's the director of the Nature Institute, and he does a very good job of articulating this concept. So check this out.
When Steiner came across Goethe's work when he was still a student at the university in Vienna, and he was studying actually more the physical sciences, and really got into Goethe's color work. And I think what he recognized or what he found in Goethe, what stimulated him in Goethe, was that here was a man who really immersed himself in the phenomenal world, didn't have lots of abstract concepts, and thereby opened himself to seeing relationships that spoke of more than the mere physical. So that, in Goethe's color work, where he talks about color arising out of the interplay of light and darkness, that the fact that you can't actually see light, what we're seeing is brightness in the world, or dark, or shades of gray, or all sorts of different colors. And the interaction of the quality of light and darkness is what brings about color in the world. And for Steiner, that was like a moment of, oh, here's a person who come from working in the sense world, has an opening into what you could call the spirit, but in a very concrete way, meaning that which arises, or that out of which the sense world sort of arises as an inner experience. Because for Steiner, for example, there's this famous conversation of Goethe and Schiller, where Goethe said, when he was talking about the plant metamorphosis and the idea of the archetypal plant, that was not for him just an idea. It was something where he said, I can see that with my eyes. So kind of the formative principle of the plant was not just an abstraction for Goethe, it was something he perceived in working with the concrete. You could say, and Goethe called it a sensible, supersensible experience. And that was for Steiner like a bridge from the physical to the spiritual, because that was what was difficult for him, Steiner as a person, was having what he called spiritual experiences, not making up things, but experiences of the spiritual nature of the world. And he couldn't talk about that with anyone, especially scientists. So that Goethe was showing you can go from the sense world to the spirit, and that spirit world, spiritual in the world, is what I'm experiencing, so to speak, from the other side. I, Steiner, am experiencing from the other side. So I think he really saw there's a bridge. Goethe forms a healthy, rigorous, he has a healthy, rigorous methodology that forms a bridge from the sense world to the spirit world, whereby that's already said falsely, because it acts as though they're two separate things. That the world is imbued with spirit, which means with meaning, with context, with relationship, and we have access to that. And I think that was a very important biographical basically for Steiner to see, here's a place where one can see that it is possible in our modern times to bridge the apparent gulf between spirit and the sense world.
Spirit is a difficult word, isn't it?
Very.
I mean, it has religious connotations which are not helpful. It's not what you mean,
right?
I imagine. I don't know if it's any easier in German, but I think for English-speaking people, it is a stumbling block.
No,
isn't it?
It is, because suddenly everything becomes unclear or somewhat mystical or non-real, or and you're very easily into a dualism, and that's what Goethe was. Really non-dualistic. I can't think of anyone who was less dualistic than Goethe, because everything was for him experience. It's just that he took and perception, but the inner, what thought perceives, was for him also a reality. And so that you could say the connections between phenomena are not sense perceptions. They're something that are given to thought. Right? They're, if you want to say, they're intuitions of thought. And without those, we would be completely lost in the world. And yet we don't take that seriously, that you could say that the connections, which are not directly sense perceptible, are part of the real world. And that's what Goethe did, and that's what Steiner did in his whole epistemology that he developed out of Goethe, where he said, the world has the thought aspect and the perceptual aspect, or the conceptual and the perceptual, and it's those two together that make reality, neither the one nor the other. The one's an abstraction on the a concept by itself is an abstraction, just the concept spirit by itself is abstraction, and perception without concepts, we actually don't see anything. We're always seeing with our concepts. So that was trying to actually do justice to actual human experience. And you use words that are taken from your culture to try to suggest what you're talking about, and it's really hard, because you're open to misunderstanding at every point. And of course Steiner's used the term spirit, and in German it is a little bit easier. Geist is not quite so far from the culture as spirit is in English, and I think it's becoming less problematic actually, but I may be wrong there.
And the significance for Steiner.
So I think he does a wonderful job of articulating some of the principles that I'm talking about here much better than myself. Let's see. Josiah, do I just unclick these and then share it again?
Yeah, that's fine. Either way, you can do that, or you can just continue as you are.
Okay. Can you see the screen now? Is everything in the right place?
Yep, there you go.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, what he was doing there was attempting in all difficulty to apply language to what we'll call spiritual experience. And it is very difficult. It doesn't make it any less relevant. So, this idea, just noticed I spelled Rudolph like the reindeer. His name's spelled with an F. But so, hopefully you got something out of that and it hit home. I'll put that in the show notes so you can watch the whole interview if you'd like. And there's maybe 4 or 5 hours of interviews that this documentarist did on Steiner and his influence on influential people from the banking industry to all sorts of different aspects of society. It's really worth your time. But we're moving through history here and gone from pre-soil all the way through, to conventional agriculture, discussing some of the future of agriculture. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an expose that's kind of worn on me over the years. I've got a religion degree from University of North Carolina, Wilmington, along with a biology degree. Somewhat counterintuitive, but that's been my experience this time around a little bit in regards to, like I said before, I'm a little bit of a seeker. And the first class that I took in religion it was very, very analytically approached. But this is one of the main things that I remembered. He told a story about Socrates, and he lived on the cusp of oral and literal traditions. There were no books back then, other than in the powers that be, and so reading changed everything for humanity. There's a great book called The Alphabet and the Goddess by Leonard Shlain, that discusses how in every context of a society moving from an oral to a written tradition, it went from a feminine base to a male dominated society. Uncanny, pretty unbelievable. But the point here is that Socrates had this literary understanding of things, and he would walk through the street and he would say, what is truth? And the person being asked would say, oh, well, the sky is blue, the soil is brown, clouds are white. And he'd say, yes, those are truths, but what is truth itself? And that was the kind of the renaissance of his manner of thinking, is that he applied a concept to a word to a concept that couldn't be seen, right? There was no truth written on a piece of paper, and people just hadn't articulated it in that way, which is really hard to understand in the world that we live in, where we're just inundated with this obviousness of that. So that was kind of the beginning of this critical thinking. And you move into Plato, and you see he had concepts like the immortality of the soul. In the Republic, he spoke of reincarnation, and he was the leading thinker of the day, politically speaking. So you have this connection to spirit, and then you move into Aristotle, and you see he shared the concept of the soul life and the spirit life, and he created a hierarchical arrangement around it. And he said the nutritive soul is this growth and metabolism that plants, animals, and humans share. The perceptive soul, pain, pleasure, instinct, desire, are people and animals share. And then the faculty of reason is what is unique to people. So this framework was really the beginning and the end of modern thinking. And that's not just me saying that. These people are seminal. We've all heard of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then you move into the Dark Ages, and we lose the thread. And this was really a recalibration period for humanity, moving from like an innate feeling to more of a critical thinking. And what comes out of that, once we got our feet back on the ground, is for lots of other things going on, obviously, but Francis Bacon articulated the scientific method, which was humanity went boom in terms of where we are today, because all of a sudden we had a method to apply to the science that we wanted to understand, and we could be critical with it. And so this idea of the scientific method, I will argue, got us to where we are. I don't think it can take us where we want to go. It's you have this is the definition of it. It's basically systematic observation, measurement, experiment, formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. These hypotheses is then turned into a theory. Once it's been proven over and over to be a replicable concept, it becomes a law. We got done talking a little bit ago about how laws don't stand up to current understandings of our ability to measure even. We've found things that move faster than the speed of light, yet biological transmutations against the law of thermodynamics, the idea of entropy, things not building themselves up but breaking themselves down. Well, that's life. It's the reverse of entropy. So we live in this world of counterintuitiveness, yet we don't allow the imagination to think about this in our education, and that's really what brings, I think, most of us to this point, is, and myself included. I haven't always thought this way. I've kind of been through the ringer in how to talk about this to begin with. You can see even in 10, 15 years of doing this, I'm stumbling through it on some level. But nature doesn't work in replicability. It works in chaos and spirals. And by definition, things don't happen the same way every time. I mean, how boring would that be, right? So our attempt to try to put things in boxes, give them a name, and call them good is an exercise in futility in the end. And you can see, when the developed testable predictions breaks down, like in the chromatography example, all is lost. Everything gets thrown out. We'll talk about water intensely at some point here, and it's the worst control on Earth, and stunts every attempt into the understanding of the anomalous nature of water that you can imagine, because every time an experiment is run, there's a contaminant in the solution, and you can't replicate and isolate the H2O molecule. It's never H2O on its own collectively. It's always picking things up, even if it's the silica in the test tube kind of thing. So, again, these things are, it's worth thinking about in order to start applying a different method of understanding and observation in our agriculture. So Steiner kind of took, I don't know how much he was influenced by Aristotle, but he was by Goethe, as we saw in that clip that I showed. And he kind of rehashed it a little bit. And he called what he did spiritual science. He never discounted the physical world. It's obvious to us, right? But he called it half the story in a loose sense. He really tried to marry the concepts rather than create one over the other. And I think people that come into his work really take him as like the mad scientist kind of thing, because what he tread upon was what was unique in our understanding. He didn't spend a whole lot of time in the physical realm. We do a really good job of understanding that. He wanted to bring forth kind of what imbues that with spirit and life. And so, Aristotle had his way of talking about the nutritive, the perceptive, and the reasoning soul. And Steiner, talked about it from, the physicality. He called the nutritive soul the etheric realm. That's why a plant doesn't fall apart. It's kind of the frequency that holds life together, if you will. The perceptive soul is known as the astral body, which is, you may have heard of astral travel in the dream state. But it's this ability to operate off of instinct and have emotion and feelings and these kinds of things that's shared by humans and animals. Plants don't retain that capacity. And then you have what he called the I organization, or the ego, consciousness, if you will. And that's unique to the human. That's why we can look in a mirror and see ourselves and say, I. An animal can't do that. So it creates a really neat little hierarchy to see how things work. And I pulled this passage out of the agriculture course, the lectures that he gave to introduce biodynamic agriculture back in 1924. And I think it reinforces this quite well. It said, this emancipation in the cosmos is almost complete for human life. For animal life, it is less so. Plant life, on the other hand, is still to a high degree immersed in the general life of nature, including the outer earthly world, the celestial cycles. So hence, we shall never understand plant life unless we bear in mind that everything which happens on the earth is but a reflection of what is taking place in the cosmos. For man, this fact is only masked because he's emancipated himself. He only bears the inner rhythms in himself. To the plant world, however, it applies in the highest degree. That is what I'd like to point out in this introductory lecture. So to translate that basically, the remnants of So by the Moon and the Farmer's Almanac is basically a remnant. If the moon affects the celestial, the moon affects plant growth, which is fairly documented. The rest of the celestial rhythms do. And many people since him have incorporated this into planting calendars. Maria Thun spent her life germinating seeds and measuring viability, I think every day for years, and developed a calendar of understanding of when you shouldn't plant, when you should harvest leaf crops versus flowers, or sow them in different capacities based on the celestial rhythms. There's all sorts of really relevant things you can get out of it. It begins to explain why a crop did great this year and not last year. Maybe it was the day you planted it on, right? Again, very worth thinking. And so I really like to ask this question, why does a plant grow up? Most people with our understanding of how we're taught these things work would say it's the extra gravity from the moon when it's full, kind of like, the tides, when we see this graphic in the textbook, it's being pulled up by the moon, it's skinny on the sides, it's, falling on the bottom. So that's somewhat oversimplified, somewhat, maybe an understatement. But, the moon doesn't win in a tug of war of gravity with the earth, put it that way. So there's something else going on. Let's call it levity, right? There's the duality, and then the human in the middle. It's kind of a seesaw, if you will, in some respects. But it's a worthy question. What is that life force that allows a plant to grow up? Victor Schauberger put it a different way. He said, we're taught about Newton sitting under the tree and getting hit in the head by the apple and pondering gravity. How much time do we spend thinking about how the apple got up there to begin with? Again, kind of fascinating, right? we don't put any kind of relevance on that phenomenon, miracle, whatever word you want to put on it. Really, it's quite overlooked and diluted in regards to our articulation and focus in science. So, I mentioned, the planning calendars. The Stella Natura is a good one as well. You can go to the website and kind of poke around on some of the concepts there and might draw some significance from it. So, there's more to life than what's physically here. I'm not sure if it's fair to say, everyone out there, if you can agree with that or not. Assuming that we can on some level, we could go start a war on who's right and wrong, and not going there. But just the very act of absorbing this and making it our own, and having reverence for this idea that the more we figure out, the more we got to figure out, is really important. And I think it's a really one of the platforms that we need to stand on in the future of agriculture, and really understand our role within the system, rather than being the domineering, what we want to get out of it type approach. It helps to ask water what it wants, ask soil what it wants. How can soil be more like soil? How does water move? Why do rivers meander and waves curl and raindrops spiral? And what happens when we don't allow water to move in this way? What happens when we don't provide plants every element on earth, as opposed to just the essential elements that have been deemed required for agriculture? They may be required for the plant to grow, but what a plant wants is an entirely different conversation. So we'll dive into a lot of these threads actionably going forward. But that's bringing us to the conclusion here. Let's just humor me, right? I'm not here to define the way you need to look at the world. I have no right nor ability, but I do have a lot of experience working with these concepts. I've seen them work. Even just from an intellectual standpoint, I've seen them change people. I've seen that perspective manifest into new activity that made people more money, even if that's just the goal that we're after. I think one of the remnants or kind of takeaways of this perspective is that you can slowly move yourself to the point where you can sustain yourself without having to have that as a goal. And isn't that really the goal? To be safe and taken care of and happy and able to apply what you want to be in the world. We're more than the sum of our parts. There's more to life than what's physically here. If you think differently, I completely respect that. And don't judge it for what it's worth. But again, I'm always interested in engaging in conversation with people in different perspectives. That's really why I was a religion degree in school, because I wanted to know how other people thought, more so than I wanted to go find a new religion. I think at that point I was running as far away from that as I could, and maybe didn't even imagine that there was life force in the world at that point, until I really found that book, Secrets of the Soil. So, just challenge you to dig a little bit deeper. I'm going to get you some resources in the show notes for this one, so that you can kind of continue that on your own. And if there are any questions, you mentioned next time we're going to talk, a little bit more about the agricultural components of plant physiology, metabolism, and start moving into some of the mineral capacities, which is, talks about soil testing and fertilization, different techniques in that regard. So, appreciate you putting up with my philosophical ranting, rambling. And if there are any questions, happy to take them.